Hi, EDUC 4400. This is Heather Lynn here, and I wanted to just talk to you guys a few minutes about the content of week 5, which has to do with assessment and assessing student learning. So this is one of the PowerPoints that is listed in your resources on Blackboard. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'm going to hit a few high points for you because some of you guys might be better at going through the PowerPoints than others, and this might encourage you to kind of think about the readings and the topic a little bit more this week as you get into your discussions in your weekly discussion forums. Okay, so hopefully I can advance my slides. So we all assess our students. This is a big part of what we have to do as teachers. Grading is necessary and a large percentage of what we do on the job, and we do it for different reasons. And so it's important to know why. There's two main kinds of assessment, formative and summative. Formative assessment is ongoing assessment that is designed to determine what students are learning, what they need to learn, what they're having trouble understanding, and just as a teacher to help you gauge how to modify your curriculum, modify your teaching approach, and modify your strategies so that you can ensure that your students are learning. So formative is daily and ongoing. It can be something as simple as asking a student questions in class and kind of hearing what they understand, or a ticket out the door, or something that just is informal but gives you a quick check of understanding. Summative assessment is typically seen more at the end of a unit or at the end of a topic or a theme, or even a major end of grade test. So summative is what happens when you've gotten to complete the content that you needed to cover to reach the objective, and it's used to determine if students understand or have met your assigned objectives. So summative is usually seen in the form of a test, or it could be a portfolio or a project, something that tends to take a longer period of time, and it tends to be more of like a culminating type of project. So you use formative checks along the way to make sure you're making progress, and then your summative assessment is your culmination of that. So it's important to understand why we're assessing. We are doing both at the same time, but we also need to be kind of understanding like the fact that assessments can have strengths and weaknesses, and every kind of assessment has its own set of strengths and weaknesses. So why do we assess? We want to know where our students are already strong or weak. A great example of this is when you start a new topic or theme or unit, you might give a pre-assessment just to see what students know before you even begin working on that topic. That helps you know where to focus your instruction. It also helps you know what they don't know. So if you assume that they already know something and then you find they don't, you're not surprised. It's also used to monitor progress. All of these things help us calibrate our teaching and change our instruction. It's also used to help inform students. So formative assessments can help students understand how they're doing as they go. You guys definitely appreciate feedback along the way in a course. If you had to take a class, but the only feedback you got was on the test at the very end of the class, I imagine you would feel uncomfortable with that. So it's used to inform students about their progress and help them know how they are doing and give them an opportunity to self-regulate. And in other words, if I need to study more because I'm not doing as well as I thought I was doing, this helps me know, okay, I need to work on this more, or I need to get tutoring. It's also used to assign grades, which is also a major outcome. Track students, which we all have different opinions on, but basically decide which groups are in the higher levels, which groups are needing more reinforcement or support. So that's kind of assigning students to different tracks. We all know that assessments are used to evaluate teachers now. The EVOS is a great example of that, value-added assessment system. It is student outcome data, but it is also used to evaluate a teacher. Teachers are given evaluation ratings based on student outcomes now. And then also because the public government demands it, there's a certain structural quality to assessment to know how are our students doing and how do we stack up against other schools in different communities or even other schools in different parts of the world. There are certain assessments that are international in nature, such as the PISA assessment, certain mathematic assessments and things like that, where you can actually see how U.S. students compare against students in other parts of the world. So these are 4 things I'd like you to think about when you are designing a good assessment. And there's a nice little acronym here called RSVP. Makes it easy to remember. So if you take nothing away from this unit, I want you to take away RSVP. If you take one thing, excuse me, not nothing, take something away from this unit. The R stands for reliability. Basically, this just means if I take this assessment in five different times, I'm going to get fairly similar results. So one assessment may have multiple versions. For example, the SATs. There's multiple versions of the SATs. If you go back and retake it, you're going to get a different SAT test. However, you're going to get fairly consistent results. If you got wildly different results, then we would have a problem with reliability with this test. We would hope we would do better with multiple administrations, but that's not because you're getting an easier test. It might be because you studied a little harder in between. So reliability means over time, it's not the scores are not going to be affected by things that are temporary in nature, and students are going to have similar performance on those tests. So if you had like a star student who took a test that should have been easy for them, but they did not get a great grade, then you might check to see, is this a trend with other students? Is this a student issue or is this an issue with my test? So again, reliability has to do with consistency. Taking a test, the results should be consistent over time. Standardized means the assessment procedures are similar for all students. So if I standardize a test, that means all of my students get tested on the same content. All of the instructions are going to be standardized for different student needs. So there's going to be a very standardized process of how we take the test. All students will have similar time periods, constraints that they can take the test. And everyone is going to be evaluated using the same criteria. So a written assessment would be more difficult to standardize because it's difficult to evaluate everyone using, you can use the same criteria, but it's a little bit harder to standardize a writing assessment. It can be done, but a lot of times when we think about standardized assessments, we think about multiple choice, closed-ended assessments that are evaluated very, very consistently over time. And it can even be evaluated by a machine, not an individual. Validity is very important. It basically means, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? So in other words, if you teach a unit on photosynthesis, your test should cover the same topics that were covered in that teaching unit. If you decide to cover something in your test that was maybe assigned in like a random reading that was not required of a student, then that would be a validity problem. Validity means the test is aligned with what the students are supposed to know and what has been taught. So a lot of people have validity issues with tests when they teach a unit and then maybe they purchase an exam or they borrow an exam from a colleague, right? And they think, this is great, I'm getting an exam on this content. But if they fail to look at the test items in the exam, they might find that the items do not match up well with what you actually taught in the class. So validity means what we expect students to know is what is actually being assessed, that we're not changing the assessment. So this is a big issue when you think about testing. And then the last piece is practicality. Is the assessment easy and inexpensive to use? How much time does the assessment take? So again, this is why standardized, closed-ended tests tests are so popular, right? They're practical. It takes me so much time to grade your writing. That is not a practical assignment. None of my assignments in this class are practical. If I really wanted to be practical, I would be giving you guys all quizzes and close-ended tests, right? Something that Blackboard could calculate for me. Instead, I'm giving you very impractical, time-consuming tests. But the advantage of those kinds of assessments is the open-ended items allow for more range of interpretation. It allows for more variety and responses. So there's value in that too. And as a teacher, you have to weigh what kind of assessment is practical for my time, yet most valid in assessing the outcomes that I'm trying to assess. So do I need special training to administer or score the assessment? A good example of that is like a writing assessment that's standardized. Teachers that are grading like end of course exams or final exams that have a writing component really ideally should be trained so they're all grading the same way. That may not be practical for some people. Does it require special materials to purchase, or is it expensive? So, ideally, in an ideal world, we're doing performance assessment, right? That shows learning, like doing your teacher leader evidence project is sort of a performance assessment, or doing your application project is a performance assessment because you have to create something. But those are not always practical assessments because they take more time, they're harder to grade. There's just a variety of other factors that are not as convenient as a close-ended. So as a teacher, practicality weighs into our decisions. We have to think about finding and striking a balance between what is practical, but what is also valid. So I'm already at 12 minutes. I'm going to finish up. I wish I could go through this entire PowerPoint, but I recognize that the attention span, in all fairness, you guys don't have time to listen to me drone on for 30 minutes, so I won't do that to you. But one thing I would like to say about assessment that is also important is when you plan your lessons, it's always important to start with the assessment and outcome in mind. So if you have an objective, in other words, what do I want my students to know, learn, be able to do? That's what you start with, and then you plan the lesson around the outcome objective. So some of you guys have heard about this. So planning lesson objectives. Let me go through here. This PowerPoint is very slow. You want to make sure that the objectives are specific. You want to make sure the objectives are clearly written. If you have a lesson and you're covering, 15 different standards, then I would definitely have some more specific objectives. So in other words, what do my students need to be able to know, learn, and do as a result of this learning task? Perform a task analysis. So in other words, once you've got those objectives in mind and you started to put your lesson together and you've got students doing things, doing activities in your lesson, decide what kind of skills do they need to do the lesson? What do they need before they even begin? What do they need to be able to know? What kind of background knowledge? What kind of other skills do they need to have in mind? And are they prepared for this lesson? What kind of skills should be taught before they can achieve the larger objective? And then how can you best include the sub-skills in the lesson? So in other words, have that big picture in mind and then do a task analysis to determine how can we best scaffold learning? How can we best provide supports to help them have the skills to achieve these objectives? Okay, and this is another big idea. You guys have probably heard about this in your own professional development at your schools, but backward planning is just basically a fancy word for saying that you plan instruction by starting with the end in mind. So I start with the goals or even the assessment, like what are we going to use? How am I assessing them? What do I want them to be able to know and do? And then setting unit objectives, and then finally after that planning daily lessons. I think a lot of rookie teachers, myself included, when I was a rookie teacher, I got caught up in just like, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do the next day? What am I going to do after that? Because we don't have a lot of experience planning units and long-range planning. But a more sophisticated way to teach is to think about the big picture and the outcomes. To start with, what do my students need to be able to do at the end of this unit? How am I going to assess them? And then with the assessment, work your way backwards and then make sure that as you get down into the nitty-gritty of your lessons, that they connect to that bigger picture. Each lesson connects back to that assessment. Each lesson builds upon each other to logically lead to that final assessment. That's really, really, really important. And I think if you can take anything away from this, take our SVP, particularly validity and practicality, and take backward planning away from this experience, because I really want you guys to think about this as you're planning objectives and lessons. So here's one example. In the PowerPoint, it has long-term objectives. The learner will be able to do all of these things. And then it has a unit objective. Okay? And then from there, you create your lessons. So the final step is to plan daily lessons. Plan the content of each lesson. Have a plan for presenting information. Plan for how you'll give students practice of the content. Plan how you will assess. So again, thinking about formative assessment in this case. And then plan how you reteach if it is needed. Because I don't know about you, but there have been times where I thought I taught it correctly, and then I see the results of the assessment, and I realized, oh gosh, they didn't learn what I thought they were going to learn. Something needs to change in how I teach this concept. So that's a very normal, reflective part of what we do as teachers, is we have to think, okay, do I need to reteach this concept? How do I need to reteach it? Do I need to reinforce certain steps? Okay, so again, you want to link your objectives and the assessment. You want to make sure that the assessment, which is the end goal and measures whether or not you met those objectives, you want to make sure they link well to what you expect them to learn. So there's many types of assessments. Some are standardized, like tests and quizzes, and then some are more performance-based, right? Like painting, cooking, a portfolio, a project. These are showing like students have to perform something or have a task or a product. That's a performance-based assessment. But there could even be things like a written assessment, like a composition. So you want to think about, again, performance assessments are very authentic in that you have students actually produce something, and there is a project or an end goal in mind, which is wonderful, but they are not very practical. They take more time, they take more effort, they're harder to grade. So finding a balance between performance assessments and closed-ended assessments is important. Okay, I'm now at 18 minutes. I'm going to stop, but I do encourage you guys to definitely review the PowerPoint on your own and think about some of these ideas and reflect upon them in your discussions.